Hello and welcome to another video from the only source of information that you need to not only survive the current apocalypse but actually enjoy it. And today I'm going to be explaining a few things about why my Bible videos are taking longer and longer to produce. I obviously understand things about the Bible that no one else does, but honestly I only really know the basics. I think that it would be wonderful to have a deep understanding of each and every detail that is recorded in the Bible, but I really don't think that we're going to be able to do that until after Christ returns. When I first started to produce Bible videos, words came to me quite easily. I had been going to church all of my life and paying careful attention to everything that my pastor, priest, or elder was saying, and all the while I was reading my Bible. So I had an incredible database of knowledge to fall back on. Before becoming what I am today, I spent 18 years as a Catholic, 9 years attending the meetings of different denominations of the Protestant religion, and 13 years as a Jehovah's Witness. Being personally involved with so many versions of Christianity, I was made very much aware of the doctrinal conflicts that existed. But after examining all of the evidence for myself, I felt adequately qualified to declare which denominational teachings of which religions best represented what was actually recorded in the Bible. Unfortunately, unbeknownst to me, all of the more significant stories that I was hearing from those religious leaders were lies, and when I would look up the verses to confirm what they were saying, the Bibles that I was using were mistranslated just enough to give credence to the lies that those religious leaders were speaking. In other words, I was not teaching truth, I was simply teaching the lies that best represented those mistranslated Bible verses. Fortunately for me, I started to discover that verses from our English translations of the Bible often contradicted those very same verses as found in other English translations of the Bible. I was smart enough to realize that both renderings of such verses could not be correct. At least one had to be wrong, and if one could be wrong, perhaps both were wrong. Up until that time, I had never imagined that anyone would be wicked enough to intentionally mistranslate the Bible. I initially believed that perhaps the mistranslations were the result of honest mistakes. The videos that I originally produced were about 25% truth combined with about 75% church doctrine. Today I am embarrassed any time that I think about it. The churches themselves probably teach about 10% truth, meaning that what I was teaching back then was not all that much more accurate than what I had been taught. You probably don't know what I'm talking about because you have never seen any of those videos. I produced them back before I became Sustenance and Covering on a YouTube channel that I no longer use. Even though those old videos weren't very accurate, the small amount of truth that they contained was enough to often get me in trouble. Most of the people that watched them became filled with rage because even though most so-called Christians love to hear stories about the Lord Jesus Christ, they are not at all interested in truth. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 3 and 4 puts it this way. The time is coming when people will not be able to endure healthy teachings, but seek out doctrines that support their lust, surrounding themselves with teachers who say what their ears crave to hear. They will refuse to listen to truth in their desperate search for fables. In any case, By the time that I started this channel, I had already begun to stumble upon many Bible verses that had been mistranslated in support of the doctrinal beliefs of the religions that I had been involved with. I'm not trying to make excuses, but it is a fact that I am much more patient with people who believe in religious doctrines as a result of believing in similar doctrines myself at one time. I honestly think that it was divine direction that led me to believe in such things as a means of teaching me to be patient with my listeners today. In any case, the experience caused me to be suspicious of everything, and as a result, my accuracy has increased dramatically. Since starting this YouTube channel, I rarely say anything based solely on English translations of the Bible. I'm rather obsessive about checking everything that I research against the original manuscripts. If you're one of the people that has noticed that it is taking me longer and longer to produce videos, you may be wondering why. The embarrassment that I experience whenever I discover that I have been teaching things that are not true has made me extremely cautious about speaking before having all of the facts. And the longer that I continue doing this, the more false teachings I discover in my own beliefs. I may seem filled with confidence from an outsider's point of view, but for where I am standing, there are many things that I am not confident about at all. Remember, I only know the basics. Understanding the details is a struggle, even for me. Perhaps especially for me. Sometimes, when I am writing a single paragraph, I can spend several days researching each ancient Hebrew or Greek line of text involved. Any time that I think that I have figured out every trick in the book that the empire has used to manipulate our Bibles, I surprise myself by stumbling upon some previously undiscovered treachery. To this day, I am still posting videos completely satisfied that I have thought of everything, only to discover days, weeks, or months later that I got something wrong. In fact, as time goes on, I am certain that I will find out that something about this video is wrong as well. Before I reveal the purpose of this video, I want you to know that what I am about to say is going to seem fairly inconsequential and boring at first. But if you hang in there to the end, you're going to hear some things that are shocking. I am certain that if you are a longtime subscriber to my videos, you're not going to want to miss what I am about to reveal. In the early days, when I felt like I knew everything, my beliefs about sexual sins were pretty much the same as everybody else's. I rarely spoke of it because I knew deep down inside that I was sexually attracted to women. And if I felt that if I spoke out against lust, I would be a hypocrite. Once I began discovering just how many lies the churches were teaching, I began to investigate everything. But initially, I never even thought about the wickedness of sex. Some doctrines are so universally ingrained into every nook and cranny of our society that it's difficult to even recognize them as doctrines. God's hatred of sexual activity is clearly and undeniably spelled out in our English translations of the Bible. Or is it? I soon discovered that the majority of the false teachings that I uncovered were things that had never felt right to me in the first place. My instincts seemingly were always more in line with what was recorded in the Bible than church doctrine. I have since heard similar feelings expressed by my subscribers, leading me to believe that I am not alone. As a natural man with natural sexual desires, I always felt bad any time that I came across a Bible verse that seemed to condemn people for having such desires. Eventually, the time came for me to pick up my Bible and start reading it once again. It would be the 8th time that I had done so. As I started to come across the verses that made me uncomfortable, instead of quickly reading through them, I researched them using Hebrew and Greek reference material to confirm that the words used by the translators were true to the original language text. I soon realized that none of the original language words that are translated as lust in our English Bibles seem to be related to the kinds of emotions that a man or woman would have towards members of the opposite sex. I was beginning to sense that I may have stumbled on to another false doctrinal teaching. But this time, what I was reading was so different from what I had always been taught that my mind simply could not accept what I was discovering at face value. I didn't even have to look into any of the original language texts where the word lust appeared to determine that the word lust, in most cases, as used in the Bible, could not possibly be about anything sexual. Each verse that I came across while researching lust was obviously about bizarre, perverted cravings for unnatural things that God hates, such as power, prestige, and wealth, but rarely about anything that could be associated with natural human sexual behavior. I was starting to feel much better about myself. I personally have never craved power over others. As a young person, I used to dream about being rich or prestigious, but by the time that I started to understand what these verses were about, those cravings had long since passed. Unlike the terrible struggle that I had been engaged in to overcome religion's version of lust for members of the opposite sex, overcoming God's version of lust for power, prestige, and wealth wasn't going to be an issue at all. As is to be expected, those who love religious rules will twist the Scriptures any way that they can as a means of supporting those rules. In this video, I am not even going to try to address each and every verse that the sex-hating theologians like to promote, but I will speak a little about one of their favorites. In the Sermon on the Mount, recorded in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus taught about the superiority of truth over religion. What Jesus said that day is understood by many to be more profound than anything that had ever been taught before or since. One of the things that he said at verse 28 is supposedly this: everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Not only is this translation severely flawed, but it is taken out of context. As quoted in the churches, this verse seems to be about the wickedness of any sexual desires that any man might have for any woman. But as originally recorded in the Sermon on the Mount, this verse is very obviously about a very specific form of perverted sexual behavior. Verse 27 and 28 together say this: you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I'm telling you that everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Obviously, verse 28 is about applying verse 27. The definition of adultery is not the same as the definition of sex. And looking at a woman lustfully, according to the original Greek text, is not about admiring the physical beauty of a woman. The original Greek word at this verse is epithemaesai, Strong's G 1937. Epithemaiosai means planning out an attempt at actually having sex. A better translation of Matthew chapter 5 and verses 27 through 28 would be, "You have heard it said that you shall not have sex with someone else's woman. But I say to you that everyone who has the intention of doing so is already guilty of adultery in his heart." In other words, a failure to actually engage in sex with someone else's girlfriend does not lessen the sin of the intention. In our modern cultures, we only apply the concept of adultery to sex with people who are legally married to someone else. But Jesus was very obviously quoting Exodus chapter 20 and verse 14, which was written at a time when men still lived by tribal law. Rules regarding sexual behavior at that time were nothing like the rules that we live by today. Love is real. It always has been. Having love certified by the state does not make love more real. Jesus was also making reference to Exodus chapter 20 and verse 17. "You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's." In other words, it is wrong to desire that which belongs to someone else. Any attempts at stealing away someone who is involved in any kind of romantic relationship would be adultery according to the Ten Commandments. Jesus' admonition not to attempt to take away someone's sex partner has nothing to do with natural sexual desires. Being sexually attracted to members of the opposite sex is an instinctive behavior, intentionally placed in man by God. Greed is not an instinctive behavior. Wicked intentions can only come from an unclean spirit. Those filled with God's Holy Spirit automatically reject any desires that would lead to causing harm. Many of the words that we currently associate with human sexuality, as used in the Bible, don't even seem to be about humans. When I would read verses such as Exodus 34:16, I found it difficult to understand the concept of having sex with gods. "And thou take of their daughters unto thy sons, and their daughters go a-whoring after their gods, and make thy sons go a-whoring after their gods." Even the translators can't agree on how to render these verses. Some render the Hebrew word zanah, Strong's H, 2181, as whoring, just like the King James Version, which I just quoted. But others render it as worship. The official definition, according to most reference materials, is fornication. The English definition of these two English words are not the same. The words whoring and worship are not normally interchangeable. If I were to say that zanah means basket, there would be no one that could question what I say unless they were willing to question every rendering of every English Bible as well. In English, fornication is defined as any sex act between two people that are not legally married. From the verses where the word fornication is found in our Bibles, I could see that our understanding of fornication could not possibly be what the original writers were trying to communicate. As it turns out, I eventually decided that the word zanah had to mean sex with people that were demon-possessed or sex with people who worshiped false gods, and I was content that even if my definition was not 100% accurate, it would still be more in line with how such words seem to be used in the Bible. As time went on, I would carefully look up all the words found in the surrounding text any time that I came across any word that ended up in our English Bibles as something sexual in nature. I eventually realized that my definition of zanah could not possibly be correct in every verse where the word was used. At some point, I felt as if the word zina must have been used to describe actual sex acts between humans and wicked angels. I think that at one time I actually said in one of my earlier videos that fornication was any sex act between a human and any other species, including angels. At the time, I was certain that humans and angels were not members of the same species. Knowing that I had produced quite a few videos that were based on my previous understanding, I went back and took a serious look at what I had posted on YouTube to make a decision as to whether to take them all down and start over from scratch or leave them up. I did not feel comfortable knowing that there were videos of me available to the public that were not accurate. Of course, all of those videos are still up, so you probably already know that I decided to leave them. Even though I was not comfortable with the idea of people learning things from me that were not accurate, I knew that if I took them down, all that my subscribers would have available to them was the vile filth produced by religious people. I'm really picky about my videos. Obviously, how I appear to the public is going to be more important to me than it is to my listeners. But another factor that I had to take into consideration is that I had a whole lot more that I needed to share with people, and stopping my life to redo my older videos would very obviously keep me from making new videos. Something else that was a really big consideration is the amount of work required to make or remake a video. The technology available to me at the time meant that a single video could take up to a full 40-hour week to tape and edit, not to mention the months that I sometimes dedicate to writing the scripts for those videos. But recently, I discovered something else about the words related to sexual sins, and this time it totally changed everything, and not in a small way. I was studying Galatians chapter 5 and discovered a very easy to discern pattern that seemingly solved the entire mystery. All of the information in Galatians chapter 5 is about distinguishing between good people and bad people. All of the character traits used to describe good people are just what we would expect to see in anyone trying to live by God's natural law. All of the character traits used to describe bad people are what we would expect to see in social climbers. Those willing to do anything to anybody in order to get ahead. The Greek word that gets translated as fornications in our English Bibles, porneia, Strong's G4202, simply means selling oneself, whether sexually or otherwise. In this verse, porneia could only mean using sex or love as a tool for improving one's social, political, or economic status. After checking every verse where the word porneia is used, I could see that I finally had a definition that would logically fit in at every verse where it is used. Since porneia is always translated as fornication in every English Bible that I have checked, I really feel as if the Hebrew word zina probably means the same thing as the Greek word porneia. As time goes on, I expect to get a better understanding of those words and hopefully figure out if, in fact, they can be defined in the same way. The Bible, as it has come down to us, was not written in English. The most ancient copies that still exist are in Hebrew and Greek. Hebrew being the language of the Old Testament and Greek being the language of the New Testament. The reason I'm telling you this is so that you will understand that figuring out the definition of porneia does not necessarily reveal the definition of zina. When Jesus was alive, the Greek Empire had taken over the task of producing Bibles in Greek, just as the Roman Empire eventually took on the task of producing Bibles in Latin, and just as the British Empire eventually took on the task of producing Bibles in English. Since the Jewish citizens of the Greek Empire had transitioned into speaking Greek long before Jesus was born, those Jews needed a Bible that was in Greek. There are religions that teach that Jesus spoke Hebrew, but no evidence exists that Jesus knew how to speak any language other than the version of Greek that was spoken in Judea during the 1st century. According to legend, Ptolemy II chose 6 men from each of the 12 tribes of Israel to translate the Hebrew part of the Bible into Greek. There are some serious flaws in this story, but in any case, these men supposedly spoke both languages fluently, and yet they seemingly never rendered the Hebrew word zanah as the Greek word porneia, although both words supposedly mean the same thing. The point that I am trying to make is that many words that are found in our Bibles having to do with human sexuality may or may not be related to sex at all. A car salesman who acts as if he is your best friend just so that he can sell you a car, or a politician who acts as if he is concerned for your well-being just to get your vote, would be considered fornicators according to the definition of the Greek word porneia, and perhaps according to the definition of the Hebrew word zanah. It cannot be denied that many occurrences of the word porneia in the Bible seemingly do involve sex, since sex was created by God to be one of the most intense ways for two people to express their love for one another. Sex by its very nature would be one of the most powerful tools that a wicked person could use to manipulate potential victims. Porneia is the reason that so many old, unattractive politicians and celebrities are married to young, sexy, beautiful, healthy men and women. The wicked are masters at using love and sex as weapons. The courts of most lands recognize this skill as a legitimate means of earning an income, and hence the judicial system of most countries richly rewards such vile behavior. Earthwide, many wealthy, powerful people have gotten where they are simply by having sexual relations with wealthy, powerful people. Even a marriage between two relatively unimportant people would be considered fornication if one or both of the people involved got married for any reason other than pure love. Using a law to lock someone into a legally binding contract in order to ensure that a man or woman will fulfill their role as a caregiver or provider in a two-person relationship would qualify as selling oneself, which is the actual definition of the word that is rendered as fornication in the Bible. That being the case, it must be acknowledged that sexual relations between two people that are legally married in nearly every case would qualify as fornication. And although by definition the English word fornication means sexual relations between people that are not married, according to the Bible definition of zanah and porneia, sexual relations between two people that are not married would rarely qualify as fornication. I am certain that my current understanding of the Bible definition of fornication will noticeably improve the accuracy of every video that I produce from this time forward. Right now, if you are a long-time subscriber, you are probably trying to remember all of the videos that I have produced about sexual sins and can't think of any. That is because I am usually smart enough not to go into great detail about things that I don't fully understand. But sometimes we can be talking about something without even realizing it. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4 says, "When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men of renown who were of old." Anybody who reads these verses will automatically recognize that the sons of God were angels that came down and impregnated human women, bringing about the birth of hybrid creatures called Nephilim. Some Bibles call them giants. The reason that everybody knows this is because most of us are familiar with the verses and have heard this explanation from some source outside of the Bible. But if we were to read these verses in their original ancient language forms without anyone to tell us what they mean, we would only be able to conclude that there were people killing things from the very beginning of human history. The word Nephilim in ancient Hebrew simply means those who cause living things to fall. And nowhere in the Bible are we told that the sons of God are angels. The only two named sons of God in the entire Bible are Adam and Jesus. Both of these men were fleshly beings when they were called sons of God. The words that are translated as daughters of men would more accurately be translated as women built from men. A perfect description of Eve, since the phrases daughters of men and sons of God are both very obviously plural, meaning more than one. It would make much more sense to understand these verses as saying destroyers were on the earth back when the men and women that God made started having children. The Bible says that God made Adam and Eve, but nowhere does it say that they were the only two humans ever made by God. We simply accept that they were based on the doctrinal teachings that they were. There are absolutely no verses in any original Hebrew or Greek Bible book saying that God only made one man and one woman. According to our English translations of the Bible, Acts chapter 17 and verse 26 says, "And he made out of one man every nation of man to dwell on the entire surface of the earth." A word-for-word literal translation would actually sound more like this: "From out of one was made every ethnicity of human that lives on the face of the earth." The point being that the word man is not to be found after the word one in any original language text. Apparently, someone, somewhere felt that the word man belonged, but there really isn't any scriptural support for this assumption. At the time, Paul was making a very specific point to the people of Athens. If you read the entire passage from verse 16 all the way to verse 31, you will see that Paul was addressing the number of idols surrounding the Areopagus. Everything that Paul said to those people related to the number of gods being worshipped by the Greeks. The point that he was making had nothing to do with the number of men that God created, but the number of gods that created man. As originally recorded in Greek Acts chapter 17 and verse 26 would be more accurately translated as, out of one God was made every ethnicity of human that lives on the face of the earth. What I am about to tell you may not agree with what you currently believe, but according to Genesis chapter 6 verses 1 through 4 as originally recorded thousands of years ago, these verses were not about illegal sexual relations between humans and angels at all. A better understanding of these verses would probably sound more like this. When humans began to multiply on the face of the land, and women were born out of the sons of God, they saw that the women built out of men were attractive, and they took any woman that they chose. Killers were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the women built out of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. If these sons of God, like Adam, were fleshly male humans that God created to populate the earth, then there would be no sin involved when they began to populate the earth. Likewise, if the women built of man were like Eve, God created from the ribs of those sons of God, there would be no sin involved in their mating with those sons of God. A person might deduce that since Eve was created for Adam, that it would not be right for her to mate with any of the other sons of God. But after reading all the verses involved, breaking them down into the original Hebrew and studying them in depth, I cannot find anything to indicate that God was at all displeased with their sexual behavior. In fact, Genesis chapter 6 verses 1 through 4 has very obviously been included in our Bibles by God to make one point and one point only, to contrast the natural, acceptable behavior of creating life with the unnatural, unacceptable behavior of destroying life. Nothing else. Please don't think that I have been holding back. I, like you, did not understand what a son of God was until about 6 months ago. I, like you, thought that a son of God was some different kind of being. When I first came to realize that these verses actually said, it was very disturbing to me. The belief that the Nephilim were the result of fornication had been the foundation of much of what I understood about the Bible. Many of the videos that I have produced were created before I understood what is and what is not fornication. After years of abuse at the hands of civilization's defenders, I have developed a rather good understanding of what to expect from the mindless religious drones that call themselves citizens. From reading the Bible, I have figured out that how people act today is no different from how they acted at any other time in human history. The irrational behavior that people engage in today reminds me of the behavior of those that lived in Jesus' day. As Jesus was traveling from town to town, miraculously healing the sick, restoring sight to the blind, and resurrecting the dead, his detractors were always present to scold him for performing such miracles on an official day of rest, or for not washing his hands before eating, or for not participating in the Jewish fast, or for any number of other nonsensical religious ritualistic behaviors. The point that I'm trying to make is that as carefully as the Jews were at watching every move that Jesus made, and picking apart every inconsequential thing that he did, they were never actually able to disprove any of his teachings. As time goes on, everything that I have been teaching about the restoration of our solar system is going to start taking place. I fully expect to start getting a lot of attention from the supporters of Satan's current empire. If they accuse me of not washing my hands before meals, or not resting on weekends, or of not participating in any of the nonsensical religious rituals of our current social order, such as pledging allegiance to flags, or watching the Super Bowl, or going in debt at Christmas time, I won't get upset. But I really don't want them to be able to accuse me of teaching contradictory things. I'm really not comfortable having videos out there that clearly state that the Nephilim were the hybrid offspring of angels and humans, knowing that I am now making videos about how the Nephilim were just people that killed things. Figuring all of this out has dramatically increased my current understanding of the Bible in ways that are exciting. Many of the verses about family relationships are starting to have much deeper meaning to me. For now, you're simply going to have to trust me when I tell you that our old understanding of Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, has stood in the way of our gaining an accurate understanding of many other basic Bible truths. But from this moment on, we are going to be learning things that would have previously been nothing more than unsolvable mysteries. Just as an example, a question that has been posted on my YouTube channel quite regularly by those wishing to discredit me, my God, or the Bible has been, where did Cain get his wife? The Bible-based religions have been addressing this question for hundreds of years using nothing more than philosophical reasoning that could never be proven from the Bible. Unlike the cults of Judaism and Christianity, we can answer that question by simply quoting Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, which clearly states that Adam and Eve were not the only son of God and woman built out of man. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that sex was involved in mankind's fall from grace. Genesis chapter 3, verses 14 and 15 clearly states that mankind's fall was caused by a lie. God told Eve that eating from the tree of knowledge of good and bad would have dire consequences, which, as it turns out, was a true teaching. Satan told Eve that eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and bad would be beneficial, which, as it turns out, was a very obvious lie. Eve did not decide what to do based on logic, but instead based on her own selfishness. She listened to the teachings of God and the teachings of the serpent, and without even thinking about which teaching seemed reasonable, selfishly chose what she felt would best benefit her personally, without taking into consideration how her actions would affect her God or anyone else. To this day, everything bad that happens in this world is the result of lying and selfishness. Just like Eve, who demanded her right to be like God, every citizen of the empire demands the same rights as granted to them by the constitutions of the lands in which they reside. Eve thought that she was freeing herself by rejecting God's law, when in reality, all that she was doing was enslaving herself to Satan's law. It is a common theme for people who are enslaved to falsely believe that they are free. Around the world, citizens of nations that are obviously nothing more than very large slave labor camps have special days set aside specifically for celebrating their false freedom. To make their freedom seem more realistic, many of the slaves are allowed to take a day off from work in order to celebrate their imaginary freedom. The serpent promised Eve that she could be like God. And despite the fact that in the course of the conversation he accused the Creator of being a liar, she submitted herself to Satan's authority. Any reasonable person would have instantly recognized Satan's words as nonsense. But at the time, Eve had never experienced being lied to. As 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 14 says, the woman was deceived. For many living today, it might seem reasonable to believe that sexual intercourse with the wicked one might be an effective way to introduce wicked character traits into the human family. But nowhere in the Bible are we told that wickedness has to be inherited biologically. There are too many verses that speak of wickedness as if it is a choice. Satan was wicked. Are we to imagine that Satan had a wicked biological father? Cain was wicked, but the Bible clearly states that Cain's father was Adam. It could be said that Eve was wicked because she listened to the serpent, but there is no denying that Eve was created from Adam's rib. Adam was a son of God. Biologically, Eve's father would have been God as well. While on earth, Jesus accused leaders of the Jewish religion of being wicked. In fact, he called them children of the serpents. Are we to believe that the Pharisees that Jesus was addressing were the biological offspring of a hybrid mating between reptiles and humans? Or perhaps that somehow the Pharisees, who were members of the Jewish race, had descended directly from Satan in some kind of way that was different from all other Jews? According to many verses, righteous people are said to be filled with the Holy Spirit or filled with a clean spirit. Wicked people are often said to be filled with an unclean spirit or unclean spirits. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 44 says, if there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. Perhaps as time goes on, we'll gain a better understanding of this verse. For now, all that we need to know is that our natural body can only come to us biologically, through our natural parents. How we get our spiritual body may have nothing to do with biological reproduction at all. It cannot be denied that as we are reading our Bibles, it often seems as if a person's spirit is an inherited trait, just like characteristics such as skin color or blood type. In the Bible, we're told that Satan was a destroyer of life. We are also told that Cain was a destroyer of life. In ancient Hebrew, the definition of Nephilim would be destroyer of life. 1 John chapter 3 and verse 12 clearly states that Cain belonged to the wicked one. And the language used is what we might expect if Satan was the biological father of Cain. In fact, there is a religious belief that is gaining in popularity that Satan was Cain's father. The Bible does not specifically explain how Satan was able to instill into Cain a spirit similar to his own. It would be presumptuous for us to think that something biological had to be involved. After all, Genesis chapter 4 and verse 1 clearly says that Adam was the father of Cain. In our Bibles, there is no denying the obvious reference to sex, conception, and birth that are associated with wickedness. Our world today is ruled by members of a single elite family that seemingly has ruled over humanity ever since the time of the pharaohs. That does not mean that only members of the ruling family have the capacity for wickedness. In one of the oldest books ever written, at Job chapter 15 and verse 35, it says, they conceive trouble and give birth to evil. Their womb prepares deceit. The words conceive, birth, and womb used here are translated properly, and yet this verse in context does not seem to be about sexual reproduction. Isaiah chapter 59 and verse 4 says, no one calls for justice, no one pleads his case honestly. They rely on empty pleas. They tell lies. They conceive mischief and give birth to iniquity. And James chapter 1 verses 13 and 15 says, Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then, desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. All of these verses are about wicked thoughts and intentions, and yet the language used is similar to the language used to describe human reproduction. The Bible repeatedly refers to this time of trouble that we are experiencing as the time of birth pains. According to the verses, associating wickedness with sexual reproduction, Satan may have simply told Cain about the benefits that could be had from murdering his brother. Cain may have simply admired Satan and imitated his example. The Bible doesn't even say anything about Satan and Cain ever interacting. It is possible that Cain's mother, Eve, passed along the wickedness that she received from Satan when she entered into his covenant and ate fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The seed within Satan that led to his rebellion seemingly was nothing more than his craving to be worshipped. The same could be said of Eve, Cain, or any other person that believes that it is his or her right to create and inflict upon others any system of rules separate and distinct from God's natural law. This pattern is spoken of at Ezekiel chapter 28 and verse 15. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created till unrighteousness was found in you. In our day, it's easy enough to observe that the wicked are nothing like the righteous. No righteous person would ever dream of world domination, and yet our world is currently run by men and women who have never dreamed of anything else. As time goes on, I am certain that we are going to learn much more related to this subject as I work through the process of correcting the information that I have posted in the past. Civilization will be exposed for what it is, even more than it has been exposed already. According to God's law, we are to honor our father and mother. In this world, many of us have parents that are our enemies and enemies of our God as well. For many of us, the current social order makes obedience to God's 10 Commandments impossible to keep. As Jesus himself said, our enemies will be those of our own household. What I am about to say may sound impossible, but many of our seemingly bad parents may one day be resurrected as much nicer people. When and if that happens, honoring our parents may become much easier. The same could be said about our original parents. Regardless of what we may think about the actions of Adam and Eve, the day may come when we can similarly honor them. In fact, as time goes on, I will be sharing information directly from the Bible that clearly states as much. No sex would be involved in Satan becoming the founding father of civilization, which he did. Since Cain became the world's first city builder, he might have honored Satan as his founding father in much the same way that patriots today honor the founding fathers of their individual nations. When Jesus was alive, he clearly warned against calling any man father. Obviously, Jesus' warning was not against referring to our biological fathers as such, but against bestowing such an honor on men who are not our biological fathers, regardless of what such men might be the fathers of. As time has gone on, I have often thought of remaking all of my best videos. As the quality of my audio and video equipment has improved, the quality of the audio and video of my older material bothers me. This isn't the first time that I have mentioned my desire to redo much of my older material. Back when I first started thinking about redoing my older videos, I could not in good conscience shut down my channel for an extended time just to slightly improve on what was already there. However, if I was to do so now, the quality would not just improve slightly. I am certain that if I were to produce new videos based on those old videos, they would be so much better that they would not even be recognizable to people that have seen the originals. In effect, any remakes of older material would be mostly new material. Now that we have discovered the true meaning of such words as zana and porneia, we no longer have to feel guilty about our natural sexual desires, knowing that many Bible verses seemingly about sex, conception, and birth have absolutely nothing to do with biological reproduction. We can stop wasting our efforts on the study of Bible genealogy and start dedicating ourselves to figuring out the true meaning of such verses. At 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verses 3 through 7, Paul said that his listeners were not to waste their time trying to figure out fables and genealogies, but instead to devote themselves to learning about important things such as love. His reasoning was that those who study such things are only trying to be seen as great teachers of the law, when in fact they have no idea what they are talking about. I spent the first 40 years of my life desperately seeking someone that I could believe in, someone that could lead me to learning the truth about God, the universe, and myself. When I found out that the Catholic Church was teaching lies, I was emotionally damaged. The same thing happened when I found out that the Protestants were teaching lies. And the final organized religion that I was involved in, Jehovah's Witnesses, was the worst, because once I realized that I had been lied to again, I felt as if I had nowhere to go. If you have had a similar experience to that of myself, you may feel somewhat disappointed over finding out that some of what I have been teaching has been very inaccurate. Hopefully you are spiritual enough to understand the difference between what the churches have spent the last 6,000 years consistently doing intentionally and what I do on occasion by mistake. I said earlier in this video that as time goes on, I am certain that I will find out that something about this video is wrong as well. As most of you know, I usually send out the transcripts of these videos to a small hand-picked group that I trust to look them over, make corrections, and send them back before I post them to YouTube. This particular script was sent out to BMX Ion, the man that runs our second YouTube channel. He only found one discrepancy. At Genesis chapter 6, verses 2 and 4, the phrase sons of God in Hebrew is Ben Elohim, not Ben El. In other words, it was not the sons of God that came into the daughters of men, but the sons of the gods, plural. At this point, I still haven't figured out why so many verses in our Bibles use the words gods, plural, as opposed to the word God, singular. As time goes on, I may discover that the use of the word Elohim, Strong's H430, will require me to make further changes to the things that I teach. When asked by the crowds how to pray, Jesus said that we were to pray to our Father, singular. So it's obvious that we are not to be praying to the gods, plural. We can be certain of one thing. The explanation given by the churches is definitely wrong, and very likely intentionally wrong by design. The hurt that I experienced at the hands of Christianity was not based on the fact that they were filling my head with inaccurate information, but on the fact that they were intentionally leading me away from learning the truth about my God, singular, and the gods, plural. Please continue to pay attention to this channel. You are about to learn some very exciting things. If you don't want to survive, don't listen to me.